Oh, Ridley, 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 what have you been up to? A few points to get out of the way before I start. Firstly, this video contains massive spoilers for both Alien Covenant and Prometheus. So if you keep watching after this warning, it's your fault. Secondly, this is more of an opinion piece than a review, so I'm not going to be recapping the plot. Thirdly, and cards on the table here, I actually really grew to like Prometheus. Visually and sonically, I thought it was absolutely fantastic. It's just a shame that they forgot to put a coherent action movie on top of it. When I first came out of the showing, I really wasn't sure about it. But time, and seeing a few fan edits, has cast a better light on it for me, by restoring deleted scenes which shed a little bit more light on some of the characters' motivations, and don't get me wrong, there's still quite a stupid crew, promotional material that adds texture to some of the characters, has brought a new appreciation for it. Don't get me wrong, it's still very flawed, but it is a AAA R-rated movie that struck out in a very strange new direction and was genuinely odd. I was actually pretty excited that Ridley had decided to just simply break with the xenomorph, which is why I had mixed feelings when it came to Alien Covenant. Personally, I would have much preferred to have Paradise, which was the title for the immediate sequel to Prometheus, but I assume somewhere along the line a combination of studio pressure, because Prometheus didn't make quite as much as it needed to be a runaway hit, and the fan community complaining about the lack of xenomorphs that led him to reintroduce them. But on to Alien Covenant. To be honest, it still has the same problem as Prometheus, visually and sonically fantastic, but with a pretty terrible script. And it certainly gives weight to what Mark Kermode, an English film critic, said about Ridley Scott, in that he's one of our finest visual directors, and he can make good movies, but only if he's got that good script. Alien Covenant is frankly a muddle, leaving many questions unanswered and bringing up new mysteries. And the dialogue is frankly as flat as a pancake. Say what you will about Prometheus, but the dialogue at least had some kind of spark to it. With Covenant, there's a particular scene where Tennessee wants to lower the ship closer to the planet in order to have a chance at rescuing the initial party. And he receives criticism from his crew, and the dialogue is frankly stilted and cliched. Now, the actors on the whole make the best of a bad job, but there are some real missteps. And the first one of those missteps we'll look at are the exchanges between David and Walter. Michael Fassbender was one of the best things about Prometheus to me. There was an eerie precision he brought to David, and I thought the use of him cribbing from Peter O'Toole in Lawrence of Arabia was frankly a masterstroke. He was calm, eerie, but pretty much unfailingly polite. But what Fassbender has brought to his portrayal of David in Covenant is, as one review put it, a rather large slice of ham. To be honest, there's a flamboyance to his performance that I think is really out of character, even if David has been left alone for 10 years and has gone frankly a bit mad. And he is rather like Vincent Price in some forgotten Hammer horror film. And the soon-to-become infamous scene where he's teaching Walters to play the flute and he talks about how he'll handle the fingering, frankly smacks of a Carry-On style farce. People in the audience where I was seeing the film giggled, and that's never a good thing. It's not to say you can't put humour in horror, and I'm not talking about comedy horror, I'm talking about the kind of humour that matches the tone of the film. With films as grim as Covenant, it has to be gallows humour. So unfortunately we have this aspect where David is like some sort of pantomime villain, spouting pun-based innuendo like he's in some sort of end-of-year version of Aladdin put on at your local pub. And then we have the numerous moments where the crew make absolutely ridiculous decisions. And yes, one of the most egregious decisions is for the reconnaissance crew to walk out on an alien planet without any protective helmets. Now, although the crew of the Prometheus took their helmets off, they did at least go out the door with them on. Because even if you have ascertained that you can breathe the atmosphere of an unknown planet, There may be all kinds of bacteria and organisms which are harmful to you. It seems like a pretty obvious conclusion to draw. But no, they wander out without their helmets, and the first two casualties of the black goo get infected precisely because of that fact. It really wouldn't have been difficult for them to go out with protective helmets, and then there to be some sort of trip or fall which could have resulted in a tear in one of the suits that they might not have noticed. And then the black goo, as we can see, tends to home in on anything organic. It could have slipped through the rip in the suit and done whatever it needed to do. Intensely sloppy protocol towards quarantine fails to convince. And that brings up another point, particularly about sci-fi and any kind of fantasy world, is that the suspension of disbelief is so important. If a film doesn't recognisably play by the rules that we would, then it at least needs to establish its own rules and rigidly follow them. And to be honest, I've already suggested that there's a way round the fact that they might have put helmets on but could still end up being infected. But somehow this has been missed, which is doubly egregious considering that was a major criticism about Prometheus. So we already have the suspension of disbelief pretty badly damaged early into the film. This also applies to the scene where Oram confronts David after shooting the necromorph, demanding to know what exactly his plan is. David leads him downstairs and shows him the now familiar alien eggs, states that they're perfectly safe and invites him to have a look. Now we all know what's going to happen here. What my problem is that the fact that Oram is clearly deeply suspicious of David, so the idea that he'd take any of his reassurances at face value seems daft. Oram peers into the egg after it's opened and gets a facehugger in the mush. Here's what could have happened instead to make that scene believable. He could have followed David down into the egg chamber with him still at gunpoint, and when the egg opened, backed up very quickly. Then the facehugger could have burst out, attached itself to his rifle like it did with another hapless crew member later on. And while Oram was wildly firing everywhere while trying to shake this thing off his rifle, he could leap off the rifle and make its attempt, lashing its tail round his throat. Oram would drop his gun and concentrate on trying to keep the facehugger off him, and this could be the point at which Dave would stride forward, put one hand on the back of the facehugger, one hand on the back of Oram's head, and pull them together. This would have been 10 times more believable and, for me, chilling, because we now know that David really is off the rails. It's also true that Covenant, in terms of the alien life cycle, does muddy the waters, especially as the protomorph that bursts out of Oram doesn't look like a chest burster. It looks like a tiny string-based puppet as it mimics David's actions. Perhaps this is a particular feature of the protomorph itself, so that's really a minor point. However, I was hoping to see something a bit different with the protomorph, and as I more or less spoiled a lot of Alien Covenant for myself by watching pretty much all the promotional material, I was quite excited seeing the full shot of the protomorph when it was trying to get into the cabin inhabited by Tennessee. By the look of it, it had a much broader jaw than we'd seen before in Xenomorphs, and I was imagining something that was much brawnier and stockier than the regular Xenomorph, a real bruiser that's perhaps less agile, but was more of an obvious physical threat. However, when we saw it from other angles, it didn't really look that much different than the regular Xenomorph, which I found disappointing. It's also true that the CGI didn't really hold up for me. I've heard Ridley Scott talk about the benefits of animatronic props and doing things in real life as much as possible. It seemed to me that when it came to the full film, a far lower percentage of it was done with practical effects. As I mentioned before, the infant protomorph looked a bit strange to me, and while the neomorph wasn't too bad, it brings up another point, in that we saw way too much of the creatures in broad daylight. Through reuse, the Xenomorph has probably lost much of its power to shock, but it still seems like a necessary tool that the less we see, the scarier things are. Most notably because that means we don't know where they are. A couple of other things, and then I'll go to what I think might have been a better basis for the film. Firstly, the shower scene. When I first saw it in the promotional material, I was willing to defend it as maybe an example of how couples element of the Covenant mission is being brought to bear on the way the crew actually holds together. In practice, it came across like something of a Friday 13th scene where people daring to have sex must be punished. And punished they are. In addition, the David Walter switch at the end was obviously far too telegraphed. But that's been covered at length by a bunch of people, so I won't go over that. I recently listened to an Empire podcast which, as well as having discussion between the regular hosts, also had a half-hour interview with Ridley Scott himself. And it was a bit sad to hear Ridley Scott talking about all the different symbolic strands that ran through it, much like Prometheus, the symbolism of which I enjoyed quite a lot. Even if the Space Jesus thing was a bit weird, it was defiantly odd and I appreciated that. But with Scott talking about Covenant, with reference to the crew being like the pilgrims who started America, the theme of sacrifice also runs throughout the film. And Scott says it points to what David may have learned about the engineers that caused him to destroy them. And talking about ancient civilizations such as the Aztecs, who, under the rule of Montezuma, sacrificed many hundreds of people to the gods in an attempt to curry favour that might seed new and successful futures. And it was perhaps this trait that David came to despise in his human creators. The unfortunate thing is that David is turning out to be like his creators, seeding new futures through entirely parasitic means. That's a pretty interesting parallel to draw. The reason this is so strange to hear from Scott is that almost none of this is well reflected in the film itself. Which brings us to the element that I was disappointed in the most: the fate of Dr. Elizabeth Shaw. It was probably the skill of Noomi Rapace making the script she was lumbered with work, but I really grew to like Shaw. And the prologue that was released fairly shortly before the film seemed to communicate a mutual respect between David and Shaw. Perhaps even some sort of redemption for the human race in David's eyes. Perhaps it was meant to hoodwink us, seeing as David ultimately seems to have turned on Shaw just as willingly as he turned against the crew of the Covenant, clearly using her body to perform experiments on. And I think it would have been much more interesting if Shaw had actually survived in stasis, and he was keeping her there until he could create a world that she might be able to survive in. And to see him be more conflicted about wiping out humanity when he owes his resurrection to the kindness of a human would be very interesting. But it seems that Shaw is dead, and that is that. Perhaps Awakening will shed more light on what exactly happened during that voyage, but it seems like in interviews Ridley Scott has demystified much of this, so who knows. So, here's what I think could have been done to fix things a little. Firstly, reduce the amount of crew. There were far too many non-entities that we didn't spend any time with and ended up just being fodder. To vastly reduce the amount of empathy we felt for them as the aliens ripped through their bodies. So really, I think the crew piloting the Covenant should have been reduced to about 6, perhaps 7, along with Walter. There should have been Daniels, Orem and Tennessee and their respective partners. Franco should have had some screen time, but died relatively early, so that we felt some empathy for Daniels. Retaining the couple's dynamic would have meant we would have been able to learn about those characters a little quicker, so I'm definitely a fan of the idea of the crew being couples themselves. Also, when the parasitic elements of the plot begin to rear their head, it would mean that we'd end up feeling the loss of characters more keenly because there are so few of them. And in that sense, I don't think there should have been more than one neomorph or protomorph. Secondly, and as I said before, I think Shaw should have remained alive in cryostasis. The implication being that David couldn't bring himself to experiment on her because of his feelings for her. This would have created a push-pull tension that would keep the audience guessing as to whether David really would betray the crew up until the last moment where he makes the switch with him and Walter. That would also remove the really obvious telegraphing. It would have meant that we would have missed out on the robot fight, but I wasn't really that jazzed about it. Thirdly, and this is based on some speculation I saw on forums before the film came out, it would have been interesting if David had found a way to splice plant life into the mix. Especially because in the trailers, we saw one of the characters brush up against pods which expelled the black goo, and resulted in him getting infected. This approach seemed to click for me, especially because in Aliens, where we saw the eggs spread out before the alien queen, they were linked together by a lattice of plant-like tendrils, and I think this would have been a convenient way to explain how David managed to grow the eggs. I like the idea of Daniels noticing that the environment was almost completely silent, and the idea that plant life was able to infect animal life would have been especially creepy, and as we know, the plant cordyceps can infect ants and essentially control their behaviour, so there is precedent for it. These are just a few ideas, but the result for me was that Alien Covenant was trying to do too much. It rather seemed like it was trying to establish a new Ripley, reboot Alien, continue Prometheus, and introduce it to a whole new audience, while still appealing to older fans. And that's a lot to do in 2 hours. Which brings us to another question. Is the xenomorph played out? Personally speaking, I think that popular culture has done a lot to lessen its impact, particularly the Aliens vs Predator universe, which I'm not a fan of. As I said earlier, I would have preferred to see Paradise rather than Alien Covenant, but it seems questionable as to whether that's going to happen at this point. Which is a shame, as there were some really interesting ideas established in Prometheus, and Alien Covenant seems to have simply sidelined them. As much as I've bashed on Alien Covenant, I'm still interested to rewatch it again, and especially when the inevitable fan edits come out. There may well be edits of it that totally transform the film. Whatever the case, it's once again in the hands of fans to try and glean something from it. And I kind of wish that hadn't been the case, that the film had been a bit more of a definitive, coherent statement about where the ideas explored in Prometheus were going. For now, we've got to wait till Alien Awakening, if it happens. And I still hope it does.